Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As we were just chatting, we had sort of thought that this would be a good moment to take our minds off of the election and everything, and not realizing that we would, of course, know the results free and clear as we have, somewhat surprisingly, I think. But still, it's really our pleasure to welcome Professor Hoffman, of course, no stranger to us at CJC or at Georgetown. Just by way of introduction, Professor Hoffman's been studying terrorism and insurgency for nearly 5 decades. He's been the director of both the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program, and of course, director of the Center for Jewish Civilization here at Georgetown. Also professor emeritus of terrorism studies at St. Andrews University in Scotland. He spent several years with RAND Corporation in various capacities, also several appointments to different parts of the US government. Bruce is, of course, among the preeminent scholars of terrorism and the author of several highly regarded and recognized books, including the sort of seminal work on terrorism, Inside Terrorism, and his most recent book with Jacob Ware, also from the CJC, God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America. There probably couldn't be a timelier analysis of the impact of far-right terrorism in the US. And Anonymous Soldiers, The Struggle for Israel from 1917 to 1947, which this lecture derives from. So, of course, today, as mentioned, is a historic day, not just because of yesterday's election, but of the events of 80 years ago today, and the assassination of Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State for the Middle East in Cairo. And we're really looking forward to Bruce's insights into the implications both for British rule in Palestine, but also for the search for a peaceful resolution between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. So please, Bruce, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very inconveniently, I lost my voice this morning. So hopefully, hot tea and this microphone will help. Yes, this will be much better, I think. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Oddly enough, there's not one student in my classes here now. So you would not know this necessarily, but it is true, as Jonathan said, that I've been studying terrorism and counterterrorism for nearly 5 decades. I started studying it when I went to graduate school in 1976, which was a long time ago. And perhaps even crazier, perhaps less comprehensible, like way to put it. I have been studying one way or the other British rule of Palestine and the history of British mandate for Palestine for 40 years. When I wrote the book Anonymous Soldiers, I stopped with that, although it tremendously, many of my students were here, you know, it tremendously informs the study of terrorism today. This isn't actually, if you've read Anonymous Soldiers, of course you should, because it's over 600 pages. So everybody to say this, every word is a jewel beyond human computation and its value. But this actually is not an excerpt. It's basically weaving together 2 chapters of material to come to what I think is a very interesting story. You can make your own judgment. This is a formal academic paper. Giving you my citations, but it's also, I think, a fascinating story that does have consequences for today, and that's why I'm very grateful to the CJC for sponsoring the talk in general, but most especially today, because on November 6th, 1944, Lord Moyne was murdered in Cairo. 2 gunmen had laid in wait as he returned home for lunch. Despite Moyne's exalted position as the British government's minister resident for the Middle East, he had no personal security detail. As soon as the long black limousine glided to a stop, his aide-de-camp, Captain A.G. Bruce Onslow, was walking briskly to unlock the front door of his villa when he heard someone say in English, "Don't move, stay where you are, don't move." Meanwhile, Moyne's driver, Corporal A.T. Fuller, was just about to open the rear passenger door when he saw a man approaching with a pistol in his hand. The gunman twice ordered Fuller to lie down on the ground. Instead, the young corporal lunged at the weapon. 3 shots rang out, Fuller collapsed on the driveway, mortally wounded. As Moyne and his personal assistant, Miss Dorothy Osmond, watched in horror, she turned to see another man peering into the limousine from her left. It was the same person who had instructed Captain Hughes Onslow to remain still. The man now told her not to move, and opening the car door, pointed a revolver directly at Moyne. First bullet struck the minister in the neck. Second in the abdomen, Moyne raised his hand in desperate effort to ward off a third shot, which sliced through his fingers and lodged in his chest. "Oh, they've shot us," Moyne exclaimed, clutching his throat before losing consciousness. The assassination of Walter Guinness, first Baron Moyne and the heir to the famous brewery fortune, is little remembered. It occurred amidst the global war of epic proportions, in which nearly 100 million others perished. In the annals of terrorism, too, far more heinous acts would follow, including the bombing 2 years later of Jerusalem's King David Hotel, where 91 persons died. But like that fateful shooting in Sarajevo 3 decades before, the repercussions of Moyne's killing had similarly far-reaching consequences, consigning a region and its people to seemingly perennial conflict. Today, on the 80th anniversary of this long-forgotten act of political violence, in a region that has experienced the worst atrocities and loss of life since, but it appropriate to reflect once again on the terrible price that terrorism exacts and the extinguished hopes and lost opportunities for peace left in its wake. To do so, let me tell you something about the assassins and their commander, as well as the terrorist organization to which they belonged, about Lord Moyne himself and the reason he was marked for death. Finally, I will highlight the ill-fated efforts of Moyne's lifelong friend and political confidant, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, to achieve a lasting resolution of Arab and Jewish claims to Palestine that the assassination effectively ended. First, the assassins. Eliyahu Hakim was a good boy. At least his parents thought so. When they asked him to quit smoking, he did. And when they asked him to abandon his budding career as a terrorist, he also complied. But like most teenagers, he promised his parents one thing but did another. In 1943, at the age of 18, Hakim reluctantly acceded to their demand that he enlist in the British Army. His parents mistakenly breathed a sigh of relief, and Eliyahu departed for training in Egypt. They hoped that he would now be far away from the reach and influence of the Freedom Fighters for Israel, the terrorist organization known to Jews by its Hebrew acronym LACHI, to the British as the Stern Gang, in reference to its founder and deceased leader, Abraham Stern, that Hakim had joined at age 16. Eliyahu, however, detested serving in the military of a country that deprived his people of their national home and occupied their land. He was already plotting to desert and rejoin LACHI when word came from the group's operational commander, the future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, to remain in place and await further instructions. Before long, Hakim was smuggling stolen arms from Egypt to Palestine. He excelled at this task and greatly impressed Shamir, who in December 1943 instructed Hakim to desert, turn to Palestine, and devote himself completely to terrorism. His brother Menachem shortly afterwards noticed a change in his youngest sibling. He became serious, Menachem recalled. Overnight, he grew up. Chance encounter that same year at the Tel Aviv Central bus station had changed Eliyahu Betsuri's life. Yes, both assassins shared the same first name. He was waiting in line when an Orthodox rabbi with a long dark beard and wearing a typical black coat and hat addressed him by name. It took a startled Betsuri a few seconds to realize that the rabbi was Shamir in disguise. They had previously fought together in another Zionist terrorist group called the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, our national military organization, that Stern and a handful of followers had left in 1940 to form Lehi. It did not take much convincing Shamir to persuade blonde-haired 21-year-old to join the smaller and more fanatical outfit. Friday evening, October 20th, 1944, Hakim waited at Cairo's Carmel Oriental wine shop for the secret instructions he had received. At 7 p.m., he had been told the man would enter the shop and go to the counter. Hakim should approach this person and offer him a cigarette. If the man accepted and said, "Thank you, my name is Yuhum," Betsuri's code name, Hakim was to reply, "It's a pleasure, my name is Benny," his own nom de guerre. Both men, however, were atypical Lehi operatives. Whereas most members were Ashkenazi Jews who hailed from Central or Eastern Europe, Hakim and Betsuri were Mizrahi, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. Accordingly, they were fluent in Arabic and thus able to navigate the urban milieu of the Arab world's largest city without attracting any attention. Thus acquainted, two men spent the rest of the month planning Moyne's assassination. They considered whether to strike by day or strike by night, at which venue, office, or residence, and how best to effect their escape. On this last point, Shamir had been explicit. This is not a suicide action, he had sternly told them. You are to make a reasonable plan for your retreat and your escape. By the end of October, the two Eliahus had agreed to a plan whereby they would shoot Moyne as he arrived home for lunch, then escape on rented bicycles, seamlessly blending into Cairo's busy big traffic. Back in Palestine, Shamir received a coded communication from Betsuri on November 1st, 1944, at great entrancement. "We should be finished with Uncle Jacques within 2 weeks," the message read. Shamir worried that the two Eliyahu's enthusiasm and mission had gotten the better of them, and that they were carelessly rushing ahead with the attack. But there was nothing at this stage that could be done, given the time lag in communication between Lehi's Egyptian cell and its Palestine headquarters. Meanwhile, having finalized their plan, two would-be assassins passed the time playing backgammon at various cafes. On Saturday evening, November 4th, Betsuri assured a member of the Lehi support cell employed to assist them that the operation he and Hakim had devised was absolutely full. Betsuri put the chance of being arrested at no more than 2%. The same odds, he confidently noted, being killed by a flower vase falling on his head while walking in the street. Special arrangements, he further explained, had been made to spirit both men out of Egypt disguised as British soldiers. Their schedule, though, was very tight because they had to be at a rendezvous point outside of Cairo within only a couple of hours. Shamir's concerns were well-founded. Things, in fact, went awry from the start. Only Moyne was supposed to die, and both Hakim, who had fired the fatal shots, and Betsuri, who had killed Fuller, was supposed to have effortlessly fled the villa on their bicycles. Instead, they were pursued by Hughes Onslow, running behind them and loudly shouting for help. Passing an Egyptian motorcycle cop joined the chase. As he gained on Betsuri, the latter halted and wheeled around, firing several warning shots in the air. Policemen also dismounted. He pointed his pistol at Betsuri and told him to drop his weapon. Instead, Betsuri took careful aim and fired at the motorcycle's tires, hoping to deflate. But his gun was empty. Betsuri was reloading it, and a bullet from the policeman's pistol struck him in the chest. Hearing the commotion, Hakim circled back on his bicycle to help his fallen comrade. In minutes, another policeman was on the scene, and both Hakim and Betsuri were under arrest. By that time, Moyne had been admitted to hospital. Approximately 40 minutes had elapsed since the shooting. Multiple blood transfusions were administered and briefly regained consciousness. But then doctors discovered that Moyne was bleeding internally from a bullet that had punctured his colon and large intestine. As he was rushed into surgery, an immensely concerned King Philip arrived at the hospital with his entourage. Despite the ministrations the monarch's own personal physician, Moyne died at 8:40 that evening. The following day, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to pay tribute to his old friend and political ally of some 3 decades. He praised Moyne as a selfless public servant and decorated combat veteran of both World War and World War I. Moyne had survived fighting guerrillas on the South African Veldt and the carnage of Gallipoli, France, and in Flanders, the Prime Minister mournfully observed, only to die at the hands of foul assassins. Britain's governance of and vision for the region, Churchill continued, had suffered a profound blow because of Moyne's death. Over the previous year, the minister resident, Prime Minister continued, had devoted himself to finding equitable solution to the Zionist problem. Churchill painted a picture of Moyne that few in the Yishuv, as the Jewish community in Palestine was known, and no one in Lehi would have recognized. I can assure the House that the Jews in Palestine have rarely lost better and more well-informed friend, Churchill intoned. Meanwhile, despite intensive interrogation, both Eliahus remained silent, hoping to give the rest of the Lechem organization in Egypt time to flee and destroy any incriminating evidence. On November 8th, 2 days after the assassination, they confessed. We are members of the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel movement, the 2 Eliahus declared. And what we have done on the instructions of this organization. The next day, Betsuri explained to his interrogators why. We are fighting the British government because it is bad, he stated. No calculations were made by us as to whether Lord Moyne was a good man or a bad man. It was considered only that he was the key man for Britain in governing the Middle East, and as such, he was responsible for what was happening in Palestine. The reason for killing Lord Moyne, he continued, is that it is a step towards forcing the British government to leave Palestine. The idea to target the apex British officialdom for the entire region had been Stern's. The Lehi leader had envisioned a stunning blow that would convey an unmistakable message of Jewish resistance and opprobrium. He had begun planning the operation in 1941, but before the group could act, Stern himself had been killed by British police. It was revived by Shamir shortly after Moyne arrived in Cairo in January 1944, and the plan was finalized that July. Steeped in the Russian revolutionary ethos, propaganda by the deed, Lehi, in Shamir's evocative words, aspired, quoting, to change the course of history by assassinating the region's most senior British officials. The most immediate effect of the assassination, however, was to alienate Zionism's most important and highly placed advocate. On November 17th, Churchill again addressed the House of Commons. This shameful crime has shocked the world, he said. It has affected none more strongly than those like myself, who in the past have been consistent friends of the Jews and constant architects of their future. If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and our labors for its future to produce only a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany, many like myself will have to consider the position we have maintained so consistently so long in the past. The message Churchill had communicated in his harsh words was indeed profound. The Prime Minister was a philo-Semite and Zionist long-standing. As a young man, he had been repelled by the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus, Jewish officer in the French army, falsely convicted of treason and exiled to Devil's Island. And as a newly elected member of Parliament in Manchester Northwest, where a third of his constituents were Jewish, Churchill had strenuously opposed the 1904 Aliens Bill, which sought to bar Jews fleeing Tsarist persecution in Russia from settling in Britain. At every critical juncture affecting the Zionist enterprise in Palestine since the Balfour Declaration, Churchill had stood by his commitment to Jewish nationhood. His unqualified hostility to the 1939 White Paper which had imposed drastic restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine, is a matter of record, as were his continuous efforts to overturn it and replace it with policy more favorable to Zionism. In fact, at the end of 1944, Churchill was poised to attain this goal. For the past 16 months, he had maneuvered to have a special ministerial committee appointed to consider a new long-term Palestine come up with a plan. He packed it with Zionism's staunchest British allies and framed its remit. The committee was thus charged to reassess the serial rejection of partition, better known nowadays as the two-state solution, advocated by successive prior commissions, as well as the discrediting white paper policy that the government Neville Chamberlain had instead adopted. The Prime Minister had also persuaded the War Cabinet to permit continued Jewish immigration to Palestine while this review was underway, including extending the March 1944 immigration deadline fixed by the White Paper. On the whole, a great day for Jews if they had known that one of the committee members, Leopold Amory, confided to his diary. Perhaps someday they will include Winston with Balfour, and to some extent myself too, as one of their, that is the Jews, real friends. Churchill decided, however, to postpone the full cabinet's final consideration of the plan until after the American presidential election on November 7, 1944. Churchill's hope was that Franklin Roosevelt's re-election would lock in American support for this new partition plan. Indeed, throughout the intervening months, the Prime Minister had not been able to conceal his glee. Churchill hinted repeatedly to a variety of Zionist leaders that their dreams of statehood would soon be realized. I have never forgotten the terrible suffering inflicted upon Jews, he told Harold Lasky, the renowned London School of Economics professor, politics, lifelong Zionist and Labor Party leader. And I am constantly thinking by what means it may lie in our power, Churchill continued, to alleviate their suffering, both during the war and the permanent settlement which must follow. Churchill also assured Dr. Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, hence the de facto leader of the global Jewry, that when the full cabinet sat down to discuss a new policy for Palestine, it would, and I'm quoting, plunge into the pie and extract a real plum, close quote. In other words, the decision to partition that country and establish a viable, independent Jewish state. But with Moyne's death, progress patiently achieved over the previous 18 months under Churchill's tutelage now ground to an abrupt and irrevocable halt. Only 3 days earlier, Churchill had instructed the cabinet secretary to place this long-promised discussion on the British cabinet's agenda. It was dropped when news of Moyne's murder broke and was never again considered. What kind of man was Lord Moyne, the Jewish-American author? Leo Badovsky, writing under a pseudonym Leo Benjamin, asked in his 1952 book about Hakim and Betsuri titled Martyrs of Cairo. To the people of Israel, Benjamin continued, this English nobleman was like some horrible blood-drinking monster, a wretch, vile and depraved. He was the scourge and bane of their nation. He was an implacable enemy of the Jewish nation. He knew that they yearned for freedom in their homeland, but they must never live to see it. They must be forever serfs, abject and groveling of imperial England. 2 decades later, Shamir himself eagerly perpetuated this column. Moyne, Shamir said in an interview, was an anti-Semite. Accordingly, there were good reasons, Shamir continued, for his being shot. Lecky had decided that Moyne must die, Shamir recalled, not only because of the office he held, the government he represents, but also because he had known about his hostile attitudes towards Zionism, Shamir continued, towards the idea of the ingathering of Jewish people here. He was against any Jewish aliyah, any Jewish immigration. He didn't believe that there exists such a thing as a Jewish nation or a Jewish people, and therefore he decided to make this operation. These were the same arguments that Lecky had used in the weeks following Moyne's killing. Posters on the walls throughout Palestine describe Moyne as an archenemy of the freedom aspirations of the Jewish people in their country. Some of the accusations pertaining to what Lehi termed Moyne's brutality, foulness, cynicism, and humiliation of Jews were familiar. They had been detailed in the group's underground newspaper about a month before Moyne's assassination. Many others were new. On top of all these crimes, Moyne was assailed for taking away the bread from the mouths of Jewish workers, interfering with debates in the United States Congress over Palestine, deliberately plunging the Yeshuv into economic crisis, and last but not least, he was an ardent follower of Nazi racialist legislation. Yet, Churchill had fulsomely praised Moyne on the floor of the House of Commons as the Jews' best and best informed friend. What then accounts for these diametrically opposed claims? It is true that as colonial secretary between 1941 and 1942, Moyne had been the vortex of several crucial decisions that negatively affected the issue. He had rejected calls to establish a separate Jewish army in exile on the grounds that the Jews of Palestine, as British subjects, both able and entirely welcome to enlist in His Majesty's forces. Moyne had always been skeptical of Palestine's ability to absorb an unlimited number of Jewish immigrants. In 1942, he had also been instrumental in denying entry to Palestine of the Struma, the dilapidated 19th century schooner packed with 769 Jews attempting to flee Europe that subsequently foundered in the Black Sea and sunk in mysterious circumstances. All but one person on board died. But despite persistent claims to the contrary, there is no evidence that Moyne was either a racist or held Nazi-like views about racial purity. As a serious amateur anthropologist and ethnographer, Moyne had admittedly once argued during a House of Lords debate that all modern peoples, including Jews, are to an extent racially mixed. But that is the sum total of the actual evidence of Moyne's alleged racism or anti-Semitism. Moyne may in fact have been more balanced and moreover even more supportive of Zionism than Lehi should have believed. In a letter to Moyne's son, heir to his title, Miss Osmond, the minister-resident's loyal secretary, recounted the story of the dinner party that Moyne was planning just weeks before his death. Guest of honor was Lord Court, the newly appointed High Commissioner for Palestine and Transjordan, who would be stopping in Cairo en route to Jerusalem. She recalled that Moyne had instructed her to remove his own advisor on Arab affairs, Brigadier General Sir Hilton Clayton, from the guest list, explaining that the minister did not want Clayton's strong anti-Zionist bias to influence Moyne. And just days before the assassination, Churchill had urged Weizmann to meet with Moyne in Cairo. Weizmann, Churchill averred, would be pleasantly surprised to find that Moyne's opinions on the viability of the Jewish state of Palestine, quote, had changed and developed the past 2 years. But surely, the most serious indictment against Moyne is the accusation that he callously blocked the entrance to Palestine of 1 million Hungarian Jews, whose freedom the Nazis had offered in exchange for trucks, coffee, tea, cocoa, and soap. Moyne's alleged role in this scheme originated in an as told to biography about Joel Brand, titled Advocate for the Dead, the Story of Joel Brand. An emissary from the Hungarian Jewish community, Brand had communicated his propositions to the British government in March 1940. More than a decade later, the book relates a muddled account of the conversation that Brand remembers having at the garden of Cairo's British Egyptian Club with an anonymous British official. The Briton whom Brand did not know, sitting at the next table, and they fell into conversation. When asked by this official, who had not introduced himself or given his name, how many Jews Adolf Eichmann actually proposed to free in exchange for the trucks and other goods, Brand replied, no. According to Brand's decade-old recollection, this person then exclaimed, 1 million? What on earth are you thinking of, Mr. Brand? What should we do with 1 million Jews? Where would we put them? As Brand rose from his seat and left the club in disgust, his host caught up and asked, "Do you know with whom you were speaking? That was our Minister of State, Lord Moyne." However, in the very next sentence of the book, Brand explains that his interlocutor was not Lord Moyne. Indeed, Brand goes on to relate how he later learned that Lord Moyne had often deployed the tragic fate of the Jews. Policy which he had to follow, however, was one dictated by a cold and impersonal administration in London. Brand then wrote, "It may be that he, Moyne, paid with his life for the guilt of others. Nonetheless, apologies for Lecky and the assassination have never allowed the truth to get in the way of a good story, and seeking to further justify Moyne's murder have since perpetuated this fiction." At the end of the day, it is clear that the main reason Lecky targeted Moyne was because of the office he held and the government he represented, a regime that Lecky fervently believed had cruelly closed the gates of Palestine to European Jews seeking to escape the Holocaust. Hakim himself is absolutely clear on this point. According to a member of the support team that Lecky had activated in Cairo to assist with the operation, Hakim had said that Lecky had decided to target him because he was the official representative of the British General Policy. Hakim added that Moyne's complicity in the Strumer disaster had also been a consideration. It is significant, though, that Hakim said nothing about Moyne's alleged anti-Semitism or anything else about Moyne's personal opinions about Jews or Zionism. But Zuri told his police interrogators exactly the same, never once mentioning Moyne's own views or prejudices. Even the explanation that Shamir recalled giving to Hakim and Zuri, before they each departed for Cairo, further belies the targeting of Moyne because of his beliefs as opposed to the office that he held. Our attack on Moyne, the Lecky commander, separately had told both Eliyahu's, to clarify exactly who the enemy is. "We smashed the dragon's head, not the tail. We believe Great Britain simply cannot carry out her promises to both the Jews and Arabs. The deed against Moyne will bring the whole issue into the world forum," here concluded, "where it will merit the attention of world opinion and world policy." The Moyne assassination was thus a crucial turning point, both the history of British rule over Palestine and the events leading to Jewish state. Among the hundreds of terrorist incidents before and after, few can compare that act in terms of significance, impact, and sheer trauma. It swept away the possibility of an early solution to the Palestine problem, immersing Britain in an intractable struggle that was not to be resolved until the creation of the State of Israel 20 years later. The assassination's repercussions were felt not only in Cairo and London, but across the Middle East, intertwining the maintenance of order in Palestine, preserving British prestige throughout the Arab world, which some British officials in the region had argued should take precedence over even the prosecution. But most of all, the assassination extinguished the prospect of resolving the Palestine problem before the war ended. The death of Moyne, a dear friend and steadfast political ally of Churchill's, had a profound and lasting effect on the Prime Minister's determination to press ahead with the partition of Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. It is impossible, of course, to determine whether Churchill's endeavors to establish this Jewish state in Palestine, backed with the British government's forthright endorsement, would have succeeded. Given the formidable opposition from the Foreign Office, the military chiefs of staff, and members of Churchill's own party, there can be no certainty that the cabinet would in fact have approved the partition proposal. But at the same time, it is clear that on the eve of Moyne's assassination, the British government had come to the threshold of major redefinition of its policy in Palestine. Hence, the Yishuv suffered a far greater penalty because of the assassination than its leaders had feared. The loss of what was likely to be an immediate favorable decision on the mandate's future. So I reside in Berlin, famed Oxford University philosopher and social and political theorist, then attached on wartime service to the British Embassy here in Washington, D.C., thus rightly describes the killing as a fateful juncture in the Jews' journey to statehood, a timely opportunity, he observed, but one that was cruelly squandered. As Weitzman himself observed in his own autobiography 5 years later, the harm done to our cause by the assassination of Lord Moyne and the whole terror, this apart from the profound moral deterioration involved, was not in changing the intentions of the British government, but rather providing our enemies with a convenient excuse, helping to justify their course for the part of overcommitment. This is indeed exactly what happened. Among those British officials already ill-disposed to Zionism, the assassination provided an ideal opening to bury the Balfour Declaration once and for all. From Cairo, Brigadier Clayton, Moyne's aforementioned advisor on Arab affairs, sent a lengthy memorandum to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, detailing his thoughts. After 4 single-spaced pages of typescript, which didactically recapitulated the government's previous spinelessness in the face of repeated Zionist terrorist provocation in Palestine, Clayton finally got to the point. All well-informed authorities in the Middle East agree that the murder of Lord Moyne is not the end of the terrorist campaign, but only a stage in its development. Indeed, he breathlessly noted, there are some grounds for believing that a blacklist of other British officials and personalities has been marked down for existence and is now circulating. No such list, in fact, is known to have actually existed. But Clayton nevertheless feverishly plowed ahead. The notion that violence and terrorism pay and pressuring Britain, he warned, would now gain further currency, with the effect that Palestine's Arabs, quoting, will be driven and encouraged to adopt similar tactics in the hope of a similar result. Clayton's message was thus clear. Failure to severely punish the Jews would have dire consequences. In this respect, Britain had presented with a perfect excuse to further circumscribe the Jewish national home in Palestine and decisively claw back its nearly 3-decade-long commitment to Zionism. HMG must publicly make it plain, Clayton argued, that they do not support the opening of Palestine to unrestricted Jewish immigration and the creation of a Jewish state, which is the avowed aim terrorist groups hope to achieve. This involves a clear understanding that HMG regard any obligations towards the Jews contracted as a result of the Balfour Declaration as having been already more than adequately discharged. Lord Killern, Britain's ambassador to Egypt, sent a similarly impassioned letter to Eden. And Sir Walter Smart, the renowned diplomat, Orientalist, highly influential voice, guiding Britain's Middle Eastern policies for some 4 decades, maintained that only such a drastic measure would be commensurate with the gravity of this crime. But perhaps the most climacteric effect of the murder was that when Churchill brought Big Three conference in Yalta with Stalin and Roosevelt, February 1945, he brought with him no British plan for Palestine's future. Throughout their discussions, Churchill remained conspicuously silent whenever the matter of Palestine was raised by either his Russian or American counterpart. Indeed, until Moyne's assassination, Churchill had intended to propose that this summit actually take place in Jerusalem, not in Malta. He had shared his idea with Weizmann, enthusing that, quoting, there are first-class hotels, government houses, and every means can be taken to ensure security, close quote. It would be the perfect setting, Churchill was convinced, both to secure American and Soviet backing petition and to demonstrate the Allies' commitment to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Finally, it remains to recount what happened to the 2 assassins, their commander, and the terrorist organization whose name Moyne was murdered. Hakim Ben-Suri's trial began on January 10th, 1945. Contemporary accounts describe a tumultuous scene. 200 to 300 spectators packed into a small courtroom. The building was itself ranked by hundreds of mounted policemen standing guard shoulder to shoulder alongside Egyptian troops with bayonets. At the center of this chaos, two defendants, watched over by six giant passive Egyptian policemen, reported to have sat calmly, chatting with their guards. The court was called to order, and the charges read. Both men readily admitted their guilt. We both came in accordance with instructions we got from the secret organization to which we belong, Betsuri declared. We met in Cairo and began acting in accordance with instructions to assassinate Lord Moyne. Betsuri went on to explain they had been specifically told to avoid injuring any Egyptians in the course of the operation. It was for this reason that Betsuri had not aimed his pistol at policemen who arrested him, but at the motorcycle's tires. Hakim revealed that Shamir had selected him for this particular operation because he was regarded as one of the best shots in the gang, and this would guarantee the accomplishment of the mission. The lieutenant commander had chosen Betsuri for his quote-unquote, Shamir's words, brilliant oratorical skills in the event that the men were arrested and had to defend themselves in court. A U.S. intelligence officer attending the trial observed of Hakim's marksmanship and Betsuri's cogency that both men have well accomplished their mission. Throughout the proceedings, neither man could evince any sign of contrition or regret for their act, and they repeatedly rejected their attorney's suggestion that they save themselves by pleading temporary insanity. What I did is right, stated a note that both defendants signed and handed to the London Daily Express's Cairo correspondent. As Betsuri later explained in a statement that's perhaps the classic elucidation of the terrorist mindset, our deeds stem from our motives, and our motives stem from our ideals. And if we prove our ideals are right and just, then our deed is just. British military censors duly forbade the publication of such statements by the press, just as the British authorities dreaded Betsuri's impassioned but eloquent defense, Hakim's placid and confident demeanor had greatly impressed the court. An account of the trial published in the Egyptian Gazette noted how both prisoners looked uncommonly cheerful and talked and laughed together. Even one of the censors present at the trial was moved to admit in his report that, quoting, both of the accused conducted themselves with extraordinary dignity. However wrong their crime may be, the majority of that room felt that the two men are sincere and in many respects admirable. It is obvious that they are not common murderers or hired assassins. The trial ended January 16. 2 days later, the court pronounced the defendants guilty and imposed the death penalty. The verdict accorded perfectly to the wishes of the government. From the outset, Churchill was determined to avoid any kind of international campaign to the assassin's clemency. Accordingly, he instructed British officials to ensure that the Egyptian government duly carried out the court's death sentence. The Prime Minister personally pressed this point on Killarney, Britain's ambassador in Cairo. I hope you will realize, he told the ambassador, that unless the sentences duly passed upon the assassins of Lord Moyne are executed, it will cause a marked breach between Great Britain and the Egyptian government. Such a gross interference with the course of justice will not be compatible with the friendly relations our two countries have established. As they may be under pressure from Zionists and American Jewry, I think it right to let you know my personal views on this matter. Churchill's concerns were not unjustified. Less than 2 weeks later, Killarney reported that the Egyptian Procurator General had made an offer to Betsuri, whereby his sentence would be commuted if only it would help to put an end to terrorism by denouncing the members of the Stern Gang. Although Betsuri rejected the deal out of hand, Killarney was furious that the Egyptian authorities should even have considered making such a proposal. This is shocking, he wrote to Churchill. Churchill, in a handwritten note at the bottom of the ambassador's top secret cable, wrote, I agree. Prime Minister's telegraph replied, or the foreign secretary's signature as well, blunt and to the point. It is of the utmost importance that both assassins should be executed. Hakim and Betsuri hanged on March 22nd, 1945. Neither had revealed to the authorities the names of their confederates in Egypt or in Palestine, much less any other useful. Hakim and Betsuri were reported to have gone to their deaths singing the Zionist national anthem, Tikva, as well as religious hymns. It is said that Hakim told his executioner that the traditional condemned man's red shirt and trousers were quote unquote the finest suit I've ever worn. That both men accepted their fate without fear or remorse can be conjectured, not only from their bearing in court and reportedly on the scaffold as well, but from a letter Hakim wrote to his parents shortly after his arrest. In the first minutes after my capturing, I was a little depressed, but now I am absolutely calm and my conscience is settled because I have the feeling that I have done my duty. I am glad to stand this test because now, more than at any other moment in my life, I am certain of the justice of my ideal because my ideal is the ideal of truth. Hakim then assured his mother and father, I have prepared for everything. I beg you not to worry too much about me, and I wish you all the best, and that you should see in our days liberated Jerusalem. Latin, for its part, returned from the irrelevance that started later. Shamir had hoped the assassination would close. Although feared by the British as dangerous fanatics, lacking both fighters and arms, group thereafter struggled for both attention and significance. It remained almost completely overshadowed by the larger and more strategic National Military Organization, or Yukon, led by another future Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. Begin admittedly was catapulted back into prominence in September 1948, then acting on the orders given by Shamir, its gunmen assassinated the Special United Nations mediator for Palestine, Count von Bernadotte. This act, however, led directly to Begin's demise. The fledgling Israeli government, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, moved swiftly to resurrect the same defense emergency regulations that Britain had relied upon to suppress Arab and Jewish unrest. Although Shamir was able to escape Dragnet by fleeing to Europe, some 250 other members were rounded up by the Israeli police and imprisoned. Today, these same regulations, long codified into Israeli law, are used, as they have been for the past 8 decades, to counter Palestinian as well as the more recent manifestations of Jewish terrorism. Shamir himself was eventually allowed to return to Israel and for a time made his living as a businessman. In 1945, however, he joined the Mossad, Israel's national intelligence agency. Shamir commanded a highly secretive Nefratz unit tasked with the assassination of Israel's most formidable enemies. He served in the Mossad for a decade before entering politics. During that time, Shamir reportedly was responsible for Operation Damocles, the targeted killing of German rocket scientists who had previously led Nazi Germany's development of these weapons and were then helping the Egyptians to acquire the same long-range attack capability. The timeless conceit of terrorists the world over is that through their violence, they can achieve political gains that would otherwise be unattainable. This was precisely the rationale offered by the person who sent these 2 young gunmen to Cairo to kill Lord Moyne. It's Shamir, a man who goes forth to take the life of another whom he does not know. The Lehi commander and future prime minister had once explained, he must believe one thing only, that by his act, he will change the course of history. But as this incident illustrates, history changed by terrorism is rarely positive and often creates great and immense suffering. A century apart, another assassin's bullets in Sarajevo, like the passenger aircraft turned into human cruise missiles on September 11, 2001, and the tragic events of October 7, 2023 in Israel demonstrate this again and again, as does the long-forgotten murder of a British official arriving home for lunch an otherwise typical afternoon 80 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. I think after 50 years of studying terrorism, we're going to get you to write this in a Netflix series, maybe do some screenplay writing. Really a fascinating story and amazing. And I'm so glad that we were able to do it actually on the day, on the anniversary. No, thank you for that. A few questions. I have many, but I'll maybe let the audience get warmed up here. But maybe to just start with maybe the most obvious question here. Excuse me. Just in the title and everything. I mean, um, certainly with the sort of polarization around our discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict, even inside Israel, um, the use of the word terrorism internally to describe the actions of Jews can be sometimes problematic. Just as we've seen in the discourse on some sectors looking at Palestinian actions, there's a reluctance to engage in the discourse on Palestinians. You are unapologetically even in your accusations of the use of terrorism. How important is that really for us? And especially thinking about it both in terms of the current discourse around Israel Palestine, but also in terms of any sort of political science or historical approach to the history of the Yishuv and of Israel.
Well, thank you. That's a great
Yeah.
question. There's a lot to answer it because it does get into things today. Well, I mean, the first book I ever published, a very small book published by Bar-Ilan University Press. The English translation was as I wrote it, but when they published it, they did commendably use the word terrorism, but then they had an asterisk. And at the bottom, they said, "This is what the British called the Etzel, the Irgun and Lehi. We know it as the underground." Okay, but at least they didn't change the word terrorism. Look, I've spent 50 years studying terrorism, and we define terrorism by the nature of the act, not by the identity of the perpetrator or whether we agree or disagree with the cause, because then all of a sudden you have a subjective definition. And this gets back to the aphorism that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom, which is nonsense. When you engage in terrorism, you have to call it what it is. And that's part of the extraordinary story, I think so, but extraordinary story of this book. This book makes no apologies, as you know, calling it terrorism. And some reviewers in Israel took exception to that because one has to say that terrorism back then is very different than it has been for the past 50 years. I mean, terrorism back then, it's very different. I mean, terrorism today, it has been for half a century about mass killing, about wanton targeting of civilians, often in increasingly or successively more heinous and depraved ways. Obviously, the events of October 7th. We're worlds away from the assassination of the individual who at least Lehi, in its own twisted logic, believed was responsible. But that was part of the ethos of Lehi. In fact, Lehi is unique. It may be one of the few, maybe it's the last terrorist group in history, but one of the few in history to actually admit they used terrorist tactics. And they said this was propaganda by the deed. You use these daring, dramatic, spectacular acts of violence to attract attention to their cause and to themselves. So they use that word too, which is very interesting. But nowadays we don't use the word terrorism, right? It's resistance, it's freedom fighters, it's statements like the non-oppressed have no right to judge the tools that the oppressed use. I mean, this is complete nonsense. Terrorism is terrorism. You have to call it what it is. And the one thing I'm proudest about this book, and as I said, the book was 600 pages. The version I handed to my publisher was over twice as long, so I had to cut a lot out of it. It's a very long book. It's still a long book. But the point is, this was a very controversial book. It always would be because of what it's talking about. I can show you when it was published in 2015 and ISIS was running rampant throughout the Levant. No one wanted to read about historical terrorism. The point is, it won two of the most prestigious awards in the Jewish world. It got the gold medal from the Washington Institute as the best book on Jewish politics, history, or culture for 2015. And then went on to win the Jewish National Book Award as the best Jewish book, whether fiction or nonfiction. Fortunately, now or that prize carries $100,000 award with it. Orrin Kessler just won it for
Yeah,
Palestine,
36, yeah.
1936. You get
He didn't get
$100,000,
100,
but
all right.
nonetheless, I'm still wearing. But this is, I think, a very important thing. You have to call things what they are, and you also have to be willing to look at your own past and excavate your own past and do it objectively. And the problem I see today, which grieves me terribly, is that terrorism is increasingly being legitimized, justified, and rationalized. It's absolutely abhorrent that terrorist groups' flags are flown on the campuses of United States universities, that Hezbollah's flag. Apart from Al Qaeda, there's no other terrorist group that has killed more Americans than Hezbollah. And yet to venerate and to applaud, to praise a group like that is absolutely abhorrent. So we have to look at our history as we look at American history and call out terrorism. And indeed, my latest book about far right terrorism in America talks about America's own legacy of terrorism. But this is what we do as scholars. We talk about the truth objectively, and we seek to create knowledge out of it, not to be activists, letting our emotions and letting our personal views seep into the classroom or indeed seep into our scholarship, or is what happens nowadays with activists to replace scholarship.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. Really important. Maybe I'll just take the prerogative of asking one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But maybe to just get back into the sort of details of this, and you ended by mentioning the assassination of Bernadotte, which is of course maybe the most famous work of the Lehi. But it's interesting, and you leave a little bit of doubt as to Lord Moyne's character, but generally we're left with the impression that ultimately he was probably a good man, maybe potentially, neutral. But it's it's interesting that they their decisions, at least if we're to buy Churchill's description of Lord Moyne as a friend of the Jews. Certainly, Bernadotte was also complicated. He certainly wanted to stymie the advantage, let's say, of the fledgling state, in the early days of the war, in exchange for sort of a peace agreement potentially. But of course, we know his history as someone who had saved Jews from the Holocaust, and exactly, and another sort of a nobleman. I mean, maybe you just talk a little bit about the character of the Lehi in some ways. I mean, they really seem to pick two pretty decent people, I would say, maybe even in Bernadotte more than decent, to single them out for assassination. And in terms of that extreme, I mean, how is their legacy viewed, both in terms of those acts in the history of Israel and even today, potentially in the current context of Israeli politics?
Well, I'll trace one direct lineage, and you will know this in Natal probably well, or anyone's from Israel, but this is another recondite sort of factoid, but Gula Cohn, who is a very famous member of the Knesset, a firebrand, extremely far right, a huge exponent of settlements in the West Bank, was a member of Lehi. She was actually their chief broadcaster on their clandestine radio. I mean, that was also depended who read it in Israel. I mean, some people got a bit upset that Lehi was inconsequential. I mean, that's, I spent decades reading documents in Britain, Israel, the United States, and elsewhere. I mean, it really wasn't, they were a group of fanatics. And the British were very scared of them because they thought they were, these crazed terrorists that would do anything. But largely because their main thing was not to target civilians, but rather to kill British policemen or to kill British civil servants. So they were assassins. But they really didn't have much effect. So they were very small. The Irgun under Begin had a much bigger effect. And that's what some people like the book because I point to the Irgun's effect and others didn't. So Lehi was really they were fanatics. And they were a splinter group of a splinter group, because don't forget the Irgun had broke off from the Haganah, which was the embryo of the Israel Defense Forces. And Haganah in Hebrew, of course, means defense. Terrorism is not defense. Conceive it as such, it's offense. So it had a very different lineage. So they were true fanatics. The one point I want to emphasize, though, which is why it's important to look at history, uncomfortable history. I want to stress something I said, is that when Bernadotte was assassinated, Ben Gurion did not hesitate a second to basically resurrect these British laws that had repressed Jews and Arabs in Palestine and basically outlawed the Lehi, arrested the entire group.
Mm.
Well, very rarely we see other governments take action against lawbreakers in their own countries, or this was, of course, some of the argument that has been used against negotiating with the Palestine authorities, that they're not zealous enough in a way like the new Israeli government was against Lehi.
Fascinating, and resonates today too in some of the thoughts about what's happening today. But please, you had your.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great talk. You mentioned that this offset the partition plan that Churchill was going to propose to his cabinet, but there was partition years later to the war. So, like, your mind, do you think there was a better chance for this partition plan had it been implemented that would have succeeded and the war would not have broken out?
That's a great question. It also ties into the first one Jonathan asked about terrorism. Is that no one ever wants to admit that terrorism works for them or wants to talk about it. So this, to me, because of the embarrassment, because especially I first started working on this subject, 1976, amazingly. I mean, no one wanted terrorism resurrected because Palestinian terrorism is the focus. But it's very important. I mean, yes, my conclusion in the book generally is that terrorism did not deliver the state of Israel to the Jewish people. That would be far too reductionist. There were 600,000 displaced people still in detention camps across Europe. President Truman was very active in favoring a Jewish state. There was the diplomacy by Haganah, by the Jewish agents. There were other factors. But what I do conclude is that terrorism, let's say the Irgun's terrorism after World War II, sped up the process and got the British. And this upsets lots of people to say that, because if we admit that terrorism works, well, everybody's going to use it. They use it anyway. But obviously, in the Palestine-Israel context, that's a very dangerous concept. In the Palestinian groups historically, maybe not Hamas, because they're much more religiously oriented, perhaps one could say fanatical, like the Stern Gang, compared to, let's say, Fatah or the mainstream groups. They studied the Jewish the Zionist underground. I mean, there's a book written about the documents in, I can't remember what it's called now, the Palestine. But it's like a library they had in Beirut. It was destroyed in 1982 during the Israeli invasion. But they had a whole library and it collected all these books and all these tomes written. Begin wrote his memoirs. Oh gosh, I mean, there's so many. Yellet Moore wrote his memoirs. Who was in the Stern. Then they studied all of them. In fact, it sounds insane. In Kandahar, Afghanistan, when the U.S. invaded in 2001, they found Menachem Begin's memoir, The Revolt, in Bin Laden's library. Now, Bin Laden was not studying that to learn how to be a terrorist. And if you know Begin was always much more of a propagandist, information operations person. But Begin made the transition from being a terrorist to founding the Hebrew Freedom Party that eventually became Likud. And 30 years later, in another historic election, proposed the Labour Party that had moved Israel without interruption. So to get to your question, yeah, well, would it have happened anyway? It's unclear, probably. I mean, Britain was withdrawn. But what pains me is that this could have been a really positive settlement that would have been backed not just by Britain, but by the United States and by the Soviet Union. And in the post-war, hit a button, unfortunately. I'll stop in a moment because you get more of an answer than you wanted. But Britain was desperate to enlist America's help in solving the Palestine problem after World War II. And in 1946 convened the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. That was, I think, the sixth committee of inquiry in the 31 years that Britain ruled Palestine and tried to figure out a solution. Then the Americans came up with a plan that British didn't like. So this was an early way that Churchill could have secured agreement backed by the three great powers before the UN had even convened. And it could have been a fait accompli that might have smoothed over what it'd be. I mean, look, 1948, first Arab-Israeli war, has constantly been refought for the past almost 80 years. This may have avoided that. Because Transjordan was very closely tied with Britain. In fact, a British Army officer commanded the Arab Legion, John Glove. So I think it could have gone differently. But I have to say, this story spins up a lot of kind of mainstream Zionist historians, like Benny Morris or the new generation of historians. We find it very interesting because it sheds light on something people didn't talk about. But people like excellent historian Michael J. Cohn, retired from Bar-Ilan some years ago. I mean, this he just hated. I used to see him in the archives all the time. We'd find all the time. This nonsense terror. He just didn't want to hear anything that had the word terrorism. Again, to understand history, we've got to look at the kinetic, the violent side of it as well.
Do you have a question? No, there's not your hand. Okay, sorry. Yeah, in the back there. Sorry. Yeah.
Me, two questions. Two questions. First, shorter one. What languages were two gunmen using when they spoke to their Egyptian captors? Was it in Arabic?
Arabic. They both were fluent in Arabic. That's why they were chosen. In fact, Hakim was born in Beirut. Batsuri was born in Jerusalem, but both of them were from Mizrahi families.
So,
Batsuri's family, I think, had come from Iraq. So they were. That's why they're chosen because they were fluent.
and the second question is the 36 Arab Revolt. Similarly, hundreds of farmers turned armed guerrilla fighters go to the mountains, start the Great Arab Revolt. Has some connection to the Sharif Hussein's attempts to reunify Jerusalem and Damascus with the larger Arab plan. But part of the Palestinian narrative, basically the founding of the nation. How do you see the quest for self-determination move from the historical saga of imperial building, the Jew in the streets of London, or the Arab versus the Palestinian in the 30s, the 40s region as a fomentation of different policies? I just wanted to reflect on something synonymous or parallel happening in the Palestinian street.
Well, when I wrote my PhD dissertation many decades ago, it was just on the Jewish violence. Man, you're excellent terrorism. I didn't focus a lot on Allah. But when I was writing Anonymous Soldiers, my publisher said, you've got to cover everything and put it into context. And I was pretty well steeped in the 1930s, especially, a little less on the 1920s. I think the biggest myth, and I heard this many times in various meetings in the West Bank and other places, is that everything was great until the Zionists came and everybody got along, which is complete nonsense. In fact, the first small Jewish immigration to Palestine that the British permitted in 1921, within months sparked riots, where the Arab police joined the rioters. I mean, the Arabs from the start or Palestinian Arabs, I should say, were from the start believed they would lose their homeland and resorted to violence. But often their targets were not the new settlers, were not Zionists. In the 1929 riots in Hebron was the ancient Jewish community in that city that had been there for centuries. Were not Zionists. They were deeply religious, but it didn't matter. It's almost like today. The Gaza envelope, I mean, these were some of the most peacefully minded people. If you read tremendous, two books that are well worth reading whenever anybody has time. One is Oren Kessler's book, Palestine, 1936, about the Arab Rebellion, which I reviewed for Bustan, which is a Tel Aviv University publication. We published a very favorable review. I'm very cranky about the possessiveness. That was such a great book. It got an extremely positive review. And then Amir Tibon's book, The Gates of Gaza. It's an incredible book. Not just because he talks about everything that happened on October 7th, which in its own right is fascinating, but he traces the history of his kibbutz and Chalaz going back to 1952, when it was settled there and they had constant threats from Gaza. But then how in the 1990s especially, there was this desire for peace, and they had a peace day where they invited people from Gaza. And in that period during the Oslo Accords, prospects of peace did burn brightest. And those were precisely the Jews that were attacked, the ones that signed up to take Gazans to hospital for cancer treatment and so on, and who actually had moved to the Gaza envelope because they wanted to be as far away as possible from the West Bank or from, let's say, the more corrosive politics of the capital. So in that sense, unfortunately, political violence is interwoven into the history of Palestine and pre-state Israel. And sadly, since then, the problem was, which the book brings out, is that very early in British rule, both sides were convinced that they could influence the British through violence. And actually, what do the terrorists do today? Right, it's the same thing. They think they can influence public opinion or international opinion through violence, and that, unfortunately, is the tragic legacy of Palestine and Israel. Is that conceptualization has never gone away.
Sorry.
It seems that today we see some similar dynamics with various militant groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah. To your opinion as an expert in terrorism, what mechanism could be developed to ensure that the non-radical population on both sides, like Lebanon and Israel, on both sides have more direct influence over peace processes rather than allowing extremists to dominate the agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it boils down to the fact that the greatest enemy of terrorists are not the military or even the fanatics on the other side. It's moderates and people who want peace. We know this in a quote from Saleh al-Aruri, who was the deputy director of Hamas's political branch, where in 2007 he told a reporter from the Times of London that our goal is to keep the Palestinians angry. We know that they would settle in a moment for peace or a quiet life if we let them. Our job is to keep them radicalized. Well, if there's a better explanation for October 7th, I don't know it. And that's exactly what we have to push back against. And what we have to find is that elusive moment for peace. That al-Aruri said this is Hamas's strategy to deprive people of, but we have to find it and embrace it. And that's why I worry so much that terrorism now is being legitimized and justified, because people don't understand the corrosive effects it has on society or on history. I mean, that's why this, to me, is such a compelling story, because it shows whether an early peace in Palestine would have lasted, whether it would have been effective, we don't know. But there's been so many failed endeavors since then.
Mm-hmm.
This was a chance when you had the three superpowers at that time who have committed to a Jewish and Palestinian, and we know that it was sulfurous influence of the Soviet Union because of Truman's support of the state of Israel. They turned on Israel, and of course, it's not Hamas who invented, or the students on campuses who invented this settler colonial phrase. It was the Soviet Union to demonize Israel, to say it was a tool of Britain. Well, obviously, everything that I've depicted here shows the new state of Israel was not a tool of Britain, but the Soviet Union was very much against Zionism because they could manipulate it for its own purposes, and because they discovered that the labor socialism of Ben Gurion and others was not communism. So that's why this would have been so important. This really could have rewrote history. But again, no one wants to hear it because it is an embarrassing story that's attended to it. Say one more thing, and when the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty was concluded, that landmark development that I guess it was 1978, that followed 77 or 78.
78, 79.
Okay.
Sure.
When that followed, one of Begin's most important demands was to repatriate the bodies of Hakim and Mitzvah and to bury them on Mount Herzl. Yeah. So we never forgot either the importance and the tragedy of this incident. But it's, as I hope I've communicated, it was a key turning point in the history of Israel.
Please, Diana, last
thank
question.
you very much. Maybe just a little bit, you can comment on what was the reaction of the Arabs to the assassination of Lord Moyne? And like in any way that influenced their own view of trajectory, like, this specific act?
That's a great question. Great. Last question. People wonder, why when all these events were unfolding during World War II, and especially after World War II in Palestine, that the Palestinian Arabs didn't have much of a voice, really. Part of it is that they were crushed by the Arab Rebellion. The Arab Rebellion was not just an uprising against British rule or an attempt to eviscerate the Zionist enterprise from Palestine. It was also a civil war. It was an internecine and fratricidal struggle where it was killing amongst families, amongst clans, between mountain and valley, Palestinians, between urban and rural ones, and basically 3 years of unremitting rebellion that was ruthlessly suppressed by the British. I mean, the British bombed villages and towns. I mean, wholesale killing. They bombed a corridor in Jaffa because British supplies were being landed at Jaffa port, and as they made their way through Jaffa, which was the Arab section, the Arab city, were getting sniped at, and there were bombs like the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices we see in modern terrorism. Their solution is they evicted the entire Arab population of like a 4-block area, and they had the planes come in and bomb basically a passageway. So they were absolutely ruthless. They broke the Arab community in Palestine, and therefore they had no representation. They exiled most of the leaders to the Seychelles in 1937. They weren't allowed to come back till long after the war. Their leader was Haj Amin al-Husseini. He was wanted as a war criminal for collaborating with the Nazis. Make no mistake about that. You can go to the U.S. National Archives in College Park, and there's a document there that Richard Breitling at American University found that I saw as well, that says the Mufti was the highest paid person in Nazi Berlin. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Hitler's favorite general, was paid less than the Mufti by the Nazis. So they had no leader, and therefore they're fairly quiescent. I mean, they liked it when Lord Killern, the ambassador, and the ambassadors in Baghdad and Beirut and Damascus all said, you've got to punish the Yishuv, the Jewish community, severely. You've got to turn your back. They loved that. I mean, there were editorials in the Palestinian Arab press and in the region about it. But they were incapable really of doing much. And that's why they were bystanders. And that's why in the 1948 war, you have surrounding Arab states descending on Israel. It's because they were so ruthlessly suppressed and defeated in the Arab Rebellion, and also the internecine fratricidal struggle, it left them incapable of really waging any kind of resistance or really having a coherent political plan.